Opinions and Beliefs by Gustave Le Bon. Book 3. The Various Forms of Logic Governing Opinions and Beliefs. Chapter 1. Classification of the various forms of logic. Section 1. Are there different forms of logic? Logic has hitherto been considered the art of reasoning and demonstrating. But to live is to act, and it is not usually demonstration that prompts action. We will show in this chapter and the following ones that the various spheres of vital and psychological activity previously listed are governed by different forms of logic. Since action constitutes, in our view, the sole criterion of a logic, we will consider as diverse those logics leading to dissimilar results. In any given action, the psychologist must not seek in isolation the goal pursued, the means employed, or the success or failure. The only elements of interest are the motives that generated the action. There are virtuous or criminal, skillful or unskillful actions. There are no illogical ones. They simply stem from different logics, and one can be used exclusively to judge others. Rational logic, for example, is too different from mystical and affective logics to be interpreted or even understood, leading to often opposing actions. They must be kept separate. The same applies to collective logic and affective logic. To consider as diverse logics generating dissimilar results is simply to apply the classification rule that places phenomena too distinct to be confused into different categories. Section 2. The 5 forms of logic. We believe we can establish 5 forms of logic. 1. Biological logic. 2. Affective logic. 3. Collective logic. 4. Mystical logic. 5. Rational logic. We will now limit ourselves to briefly summarizing their characteristics, devoting separate chapters to each of them. Biological logic. The reasons that led us to establish this form of logic would be too numerous to list here. We will give them in the chapter devoted to its study. Let us simply say now that biological logic, which governs the maintenance of beings and the creation of their forms, bears no trace of the influence of our will, but produces adaptations directed in a specific direction by forces unknown to us. These forces seem to act as if they possessed a reason superior to our own, and are not mechanical in nature, since their action varies at every moment according to the goal to be achieved. Adding biological logic, which far surpasses most others, to other forms of logic will only fill a gap concealed by old metaphysical theories. Affective logic. Psychologists used to know only rational logic. They are beginning to add affective logic, or the logic of feelings, which is entirely distinct from rational logic. These two forms of logic differ primarily in that intellectual associations can be conscious, while those of affective states remain unconscious. Affective logic governs most of our actions. Collective logic. This form of logic should not be confused with the previous one. We showed many years ago that people behave differently in crowds than in isolation. They are therefore guided by a special logic, since it implies the existence of elements observable only in crowds. Mystical logic. This form of logic is the result of a particular state of mind, called mystical. Universal in the early days of humanity, it still appears to be quite widespread. For mystical minds, the sequence of events is not regular. It depends on superior beings or forces whose will we simply submit to. Mystical logic has determined and continues to determine a great many of the actions of the vast majority of people. It differs, as we shall see, from the unconscious logic of feelings, not only because it is conscious and involves deliberation, but above all because its influence can generate actions diametrically opposed to those dictated by affective logic. Rational logic. This logic is the art of voluntarily associating mental representations and perceiving their similarities and differences, that is, their relationships. It is practically the only logic that psychologists have studied. Since Aristotle, countless books have been devoted to it. Section 3. Coexistence of the various forms of logic. All the preceding forms of logic can overlap, merge, or clash within the same beings. Depending on the time and the race, one of them may sometimes prevail, but without ever completely eliminating the others. Emotional logic led an Athenian general, jealous of his rivals, to declare war on them. Mystical logic made him consult the oracles on the opportune moment for operations. Rational logic guided his tactics. Throughout all these actions, biological logic sustained him. The following study of the various forms of logic previously listed will provide a better understanding of their characteristics. The reader should not expect to have their mechanisms revealed. These mechanisms are, in fact, very little known, both for rational logic, the most studied of all, and for the others. The existence of various forms of logic is demonstrated only by their results. They represent postulates verified only by the consequences that follow from them. Even the most exact sciences, physics for example, are obligated to base their work on pure hypotheses, transformed into probable truths when their necessity is demonstrated. All explanations of light, heat, and electricity, that is, almost all of physics, rest on the hypothesis of the ether. To this completely unknown substance, it has been necessary to attribute incomprehensible and even irreconcilable properties, such as a rigidity greater than that of steel, even though material bodies move through it without difficulty. A new phenomenon is forcing physicists to attribute to the ether new properties, often contrary to those already accepted. Thus, after having assumed it to have a density infinitely lower than that of gases, it is now granted 1 millions of times greater than that of the heaviest metals. If the study of the sciences as precise as physics requires hypotheses, It should come as no surprise that we proceed in the same way in a much more complicated science, psychology. The physicist does not claim that the ether exists. He simply says that things happen as if the ether existed, and that all phenomena would remain incomprehensible without this supposed existence. Nor do we claim that there are forms of logic constituting distinct entities. We only say that they are necessary and that things happen as if they actually existed. Chapter 2: Biological Logic. Section 1: The Role of Biological Logic. Even the simplest vital phenomena, such as those observed in single-celled organisms, are always extremely complex. Their manifestations depend on rigorous chains of events analogous to those we call logic when applied to intellectual processes. There is no reason not to designate them by the same term. Biological logic governs all phenomena of organic life. The actions performed by the various cells of the body, without any conscious participation, have no character of mechanical inevitability and vary according to daily needs. They seem to be guided by a particular reason, very different from our own and often much more reliable. To demonstrate this, it will suffice to recall what I wrote on this subject in my book, The Evolution of Matter. Quote, "The atomic structures that microscopic cells are able to produce include not only the most sophisticated operations of our laboratories, etherification, oxidation, reduction, polymerization, etc., but many others more difficult than we could ever imitate. By unsuspected means, vital cells build these complex and varied compounds. Albuminoids, cellulose, fats, starch, etc., necessary for the maintenance of life. They know how to decompose the most stable substances such as sodium chloride, extract nitrogen from ammonia salts, phosphorates from phosphates, etc." End quote. Quote, "All these works, so precise, so admirably adapted to a purpose, are directed by forces of which we have no idea, and which act exactly as if they possessed a clairvoyance far superior to our reason. The work they accomplish at every moment of existence soars far above what the most advanced science can achieve." End quote. Quote, "A scientist capable of solving with his intelligence problems solved at any given moment by the humble cells of a tiny creature would be so superior to other men that he could be considered a god." Unquote. The processes of biological life demonstrate the necessity of constant variation. If a useless or dangerous substance is introduced into the organism, it will be neutralized or rejected. A useful element, on the other hand, is sent to different organs and undergoes highly sophisticated physical transformations. These thousands of small, partial operations intertwine without harming one another because they are directed with perfect precision. As soon as the rigorous guiding logic of the nervous system ceases, death ensues. These nerve centers thus constitute what could be called centers of biological reasoning. They direct life and protect it by creating various defense mechanisms according to the circumstances. As Dr. Bonnier so aptly puts it, quote, "Better than any physiologist, any physician, they know what is best for the diseased organ. Awakening their dormancy when it occurs is the only possible role of the most advanced science. End quote. When a cell evolves into a certain form, when an animal completely regenerates an amputated organ with the nerves, muscles, and vessels, we observe that biological logic creates, for these unforeseen accidents, a series of phenomena that no effort of rational logic could imitate or even understand. It is still biological logic that teaches the bird the mechanism of flight and how it must modify it according to the circumstances. It took many centuries for humankind's rational logic to allow it to imitate it to some extent. This precision of vital acts, their daily adaptation to constantly changing conditions, their ability to defend the organism against unforeseen attacks from the outside world, have made us consider the expression biological logic as necessary. The constant adaptation to ever-changing elements, the precision of the methods employed by the organs acting under the influence of biological logic, are clearly marked in the table of Dr. S. Artault, which I summarize a little, of the organism's struggle against microbes. Quote, two armies are facing each other, one within its fortified enclosure, the organism, the other that comes to besiege it, bacteria, etc. As soon as the first defensive works are taken, and the enemy has penetrated through some breach in the stronghold, the commander-in-chief, sympathetic center, begins by distributing stimulants, opsonins, to his troops. Thus whetted, the troops, leukocytes, advance on the point under attack. Then comes the hand-to-hand combat, the destruction of the invaders, whose corpses are devoured on the spot, phagocytosis. The general then organizes the territorial defense, dispersing his seasoned and experienced veterans who thwart any further attempt by this known enemy, immunization. End quote. Quote, but sometimes the fighting drags on. The local troops, more or less exhausted, retreat or remain in their quarters. Then the siege army, which has also remained in its positions, sends them volleys of asphyxiating shells, toxins, antigens. Most often, under this insidious attack, the tissues retaliate with a discharge of products that annihilate or neutralize the first ones, antitoxins, antibodies. Unquote. Biological logic governs the lifespan of the individual and that of the species to which they belong. Individual life is very short, that of the species much longer, but not eternal, since none of the geological species whose remains we find have survived to this day. They were preceded and followed by others, also of limited duration. Species seem to disappear when, Too stabilized by a heavy ancestral legacy, they can no longer adapt to environmental changes. This history of the plant and animal world was also the history of many peoples. The childhood of a species, an individual, or a people is characterized by an excessive plasticity that allows it to adapt to all environmental variations. Its old age, on the contrary, is accompanied by a rigidity that prevents adaptation. It is therefore easy to understand that environmental changes capable of fostering the development of a being at the beginning of its existence can also cause it to perish at its decline. This explains why populations that become too old disappear when they can no longer adapt. If biological logic were limited to regulating the functions of life, we could perhaps neglect its study, but it also encompasses important factors in opinions, beliefs, and consequently behavior. Since feelings are grounded in life, it is understandable that biological logic not only influences emotional logic, but can sometimes seem to merge with it. Nevertheless, the two remain distinctly separate. Biological life is simply the ground on which emotional life takes root. It therefore remains inexplicable that psychologists ignore biological logic. It is the most important of all forms of logic because it is the most compelling. When it commands, the others obey. Section 2. Biological logic and instincts. The differences between biological and emotional logic are further revealed by the study of various phenomena, usually lumped together under the name of instinct. Bergson is right to separate instinct from intelligence, but he is only partially correct. A multitude of instincts are intellectual or emotional habits accumulated through heredity. For biological phenomena, not only the simplest like hunger and love, but also the highly complex ones observed in insects, the separation from intelligence seems complete. The study of certain forms of instinct is extremely difficult. To shed some light on it, one must abandon all the ideas of classical psychology. We must admit, in fact, that by unknown but undeniable processes, since we observe them, the lowest creatures can act in certain cases as a man guided by a very high reason would. And this reasoning appears not only in relatively high-ranking beings such as insects, but also in an organism as primitive as those sexless, formless, single-celled beings that mark the dawn of life. An amoeba, that is to say, a simple globule of protoplasm, wishing to seize prey, performs actions adapted to the goal at hand, and varying according to circumstances, as if this rudimentary being could perform certain forms of reasoning. Observing the meticulous care taken by insects to protect eggs from which will emerge larvae of a form very different from their own, and which they most often will never see, Darwin declared, quote, that it is fruitless to speculate on this subject, unquote. The laws of biological logic certainly remain incomprehensible, but we must carefully observe their effects to show that they are in no way conditioned by that kind of blind force to which we apply the term instinct. On the contrary, nothing is more insightful than the workings of biological logic. Its mechanism remains unknown, but the meaning of its drive is accessible. The aim is always to create in the individual the means necessary either for its perpetuation or for its adaptation to external conditions. These methods are of an ingenuity that surpasses our own. Numerous naturalists, Blanchard, Faber, and others, have demonstrated the perfection of insects' actions, as well as their discernment and their ability to adapt their behavior to circumstances. They know, for example, how to modify the quality of the food prepared for their larvae, depending on whether they are male or female. Certain insects, not at all carnivorous, but whose larvae can only feed on live prey, paralyze them so that they can wait, without decomposing, for the hatching of the creatures that will devour them. Determining such paralysis would be a difficult operation for a skilled anatomist. However, it never hinders the insect. It knows how to attack only those beetles whose motor nerve centers are close enough to touch, which allows it to induce paralysis with a single sting. Among the immense number of beetles, only two groups, the weevils and the jewel beetles, fulfill these conditions. Faber recognizes that to the general instinct of the insect which guides it in the immutable acts of its species is superimposed something "conscious and perfectible through experience. Not daring to call this rudimentary aptitude intelligence, a title too high for it, I will call it," he says, "discernment." What Faber calls discernment produces results that even the most skilled scientist would find very difficult to achieve. Therefore, he is forced to conclude that "the insect amazes and terrifies us with its profound lucidity." Unquote. Numerous similar facts observed in ants and bees by a learned Academician, Gaston Bonnier, led them to attribute to insects a faculty which he called collective reasoning. It shows the bees rigorously obeying the orders decreed by the hive's steering committee, orders that vary according to the information reported by the researchers who are sent out every morning to the surrounding area. Leaving the hive with a specific order, the insect carries it out punctually. If, for example, the committee sends it to fetch water from a basin, even if drops of syrup or honey were scattered nearby, the insect would not touch them. Those assigned to collecting nectar would not gather pollen, and so on. The social organization of these little beings is rigorously regulated. A beehive, says the same author, offers a perfect example of the egalitarian constitution of state socialism. Neither love, nor devotion, nor pity, nor charity, everything is sacrificed to society and its preservation. Through ceaseless work, no government, no leaders, discipline without subordination. This is the ideal of collectivism realized. Unquote. These facts, multiplied by observation, are increasingly perplexing the adherents of old rationalist psychology. In the past, a precious word, instinct, was used to interpret them. But it must be acknowledged that beneath this worn-out term lies a whole order of profoundly unknown phenomena. In the past, instinct was considered a kind of immutable faculty guaranteed by nature, granted by nature to animals at the very moment of their formation, to guide them through the acts of life, like a shepherd leading his flock. Descartes considered animals to be mere automata, and this marvelous automatism seemed very simple to him. With animals being better studied, it became necessary to acknowledge the variability of these supposedly immutable instincts. The bee, for example, knows perfectly well how to transform its hive as soon as it becomes necessary. In a note entitled, quote, Gradation and Refinement of Instinct in African Solitary Wasps, unquote, published in the Proceedings of the Academy of Sciences in October 19, 1908, Mr. Rubord demonstrates among the species of the genus Cynagris, quote, the most remarkable differences, to such an extent that one can trace the main stages of an unsuspected evolution from the instinct of solitary wasps to that of social wasps, unquote. Nests that are initially solitary, before becoming more clustered together, undoubtedly represent the primitive form of social wasp colonies. The phenomena observed in insects are also found in higher animals. They are capable of feats that would imply advanced science, if rational logic were to dictate them. One example is the storage of a reserve of energy to ascend through the air effortlessly. This is achieved by many birds, swallows, falcons, and so on, which, while pursuing their prey, descend from a great height. They then fold their wings and let themselves fall along a parabolic trajectory, and use the energy generated by the descent to ascend back into the atmosphere. This energy is considerable, being presented by half the product of their mass and the square of their velocity. The bird also knows how to capture the energy it finds in descending air currents and adapt immediately, through the appropriate movements, to sudden changes in wind direction. The term biological logic which we have created certainly cannot constitute an explanation, but it at least has the advantage of showing that all the acts, supposedly instinctive, of animals must be removed from this domain of blind forces where they had been buried until now. To renounce purely mechanical explanations like those of Descartes is to understand at the same time that there exists an immense sphere of psychic life, completely unexplored, and whose existence we can barely glimpse. The preceding facts may seem somewhat removed from the purpose of this work. However, they constitute an essential part of it. When we study the factors of our opinions and beliefs, we must not forget that beneath the surface of things lies a world of forces inaccessible to our reason, more powerful than reason, and which often guides it. Remaining within the realm of accessible truths, we will summarize this chapter by saying that biological logic preceded all others and that life would have been impossible without it. If its action were to cease, our planet would revert to a bleak desert, prey to the blind forces of nature. That is to say, to forces that are still unorganized. Chapter 3: Affective Logic and Collective Logic. Section 1: Affective Logic. We have long been able to distinguish between the sphere of feeling and that of reason in the human soul. Only in recent times have we begun to speak of the logic of feelings. Before we could differentiate between intellectual logic and the logic of feelings, we first had to recognize that emotional life has an autonomous existence independent of intellectual life. This latter concept appeared very late in the history of the world, whereas emotional existence and the logic it implies have guided living beings since geological times. All felt before they knew, guided solely by biological and emotional logic. Animals lived perfectly well and fulfilled their destiny. A simple hen knows how to raise her chicks, guide them, teach them to feed themselves, and protect them from their enemies. These processes are somewhat disregarded by psychologists, who thus avoid the effort required to understand them. When we know, when we only knew rational logic, all our judgments seemed to be of purely intellectual origin. This is true in scientific matters, but rarely in everyday subjects formed during daily life. More often than not, it is affective logic that serves as their basis and thus becomes our true guide. The accuracy of this fundamental proposition becomes increasingly apparent as the influence of emotional factors is better understood. In this realm, illuminated by lights other than logic, other than those of reason, events unfold according to rigorous rules quite foreign to our rational logic. Until now, relegated to the whims of novelists and poets, affective logic is destined to play a leading role in the psychology of the future. As Ribot aptly puts it, quote, "The place of affective influences in psychic life is paramount. Knowledge appears not as a mistress but as a servant." Unquote. Section 2. Comparison of affective logic and rational logic. The respective characteristics of rational logic and affective logic will be highlighted by comparing them. Rational logic governs the cycle of conscious mental activity. Affective logic dominates that of unconscious mental activity. Because the workings of emotional logic are unconscious, the evolution of our feelings remains largely inaccessible. We are masters of our intellectual life, but not of our emotional life. Sympathy and antipathy can be restrained but not controlled. Emotional logic and rational logic are too distinct to have a common measure. It is therefore impossible, as I have already said, to express affective elements precisely in intellectual terms. Rational logic can neither understand nor translate nor judge actions dictated by the logic of feelings. The words we use to try to represent feelings convey them very poorly. They only succeed somewhat through association. The habit of linking feelings to the sound of certain words gives those words the power to evoke affective mental representations. Music, the true language of feelings, evokes them much better than words, but lacking precision, it only allows for a very vague relationship between beings. Emotional logic, ignoring rational logic, most often imposes a resolution before the latter had finished deliberating. The former takes into account neither reasons nor contradictions nor principles. Rational logic relies on objective elements drawn from experience and observation. These elements consist of precise, isolated facts that can be measured. Emotional logic, on the other hand, is supported only by subjective elements formed within ourselves, the value of which cannot be accurately assessed through measurement. For this reason, the conscious mental representations created by emotional logic always remain imprecise. In rational logic, ideas can be associated according to certain universally accepted rules. In emotional logic, feelings generally group themselves outside of our control and according to a precise but poorly understood mechanism. At most, we can say that certain feelings give rise to others that combine them. Pain engenders sadness, love creates joy, anger, the desire for revenge, and so on. Because of their objective nature, the rules of rational logic are applied in the same way by all people who have reached a certain level of education. This is why, on scientific subjects, they always end up agreeing. Affective logic, on the other hand, varies from one person to another because individuals' feelings are very different. In all the areas it governs, religious, moral, political beliefs, and so on, agreement is, for this reason, impossible. Since the rules of effective logic cannot be universal like those of rational logic, a treatise on effective logic that is true for one individual or a certain category of individuals would not be true for others. A book on rational logic, on the other hand, is an invariable value for everyone. The preceding considerations show that the same things viewed from the perspective of intellectual or effective logic necessarily appear different. The general error is to try and judge the phenomena governed by the logic of feelings using reason. Although the laws of emotional logic are poorly understood, experience has taught us certain empirical rules often used by great orators. Without wasting time stringing together arguments capable of convincing at best, but not inciting to action, they gradually awaken emotions, skillfully varying them, knowing full well that the sensitivity produced by a particular stimulus is quickly exhausted. Through skillful gradations, evocative words, gestures, and intonations, they create the emotional atmosphere in which their conclusions will be accepted. Since feelings are the true motives behind our actions, it is only natural that their logic should guide us. By stirring up people's passions, we change their behavior. By subjugating hearts, we compel wills. The only use of rational logic for a speaker is to create frameworks that allow him to structure his speeches. Emotional factors constantly influence our worldviews and underlie our moral, religious, political, and social ideas. Even scientific truths are imbued with them in their theories. Fortunately, emotional logic does not always govern us. Through a mechanism we will soon examine, intellectual logic sometimes manages to control its impulses. Domination is not easy. Moreover, since after centuries of accumulation it remains weak. Nevertheless, we can see the progress made by observing, through the study of savages, what primitive peoples were like when dominated by pure sentimentality. These primitive beings, beyond the grasp of intellectual logic, obey their every impulse. As soon as hunger drives them, they rush upon their prey. Inspired by hatred, they hurl themselves at their enemy. Such was the existence of the first humans, whom philosophers of the Revolution presented to us as models. Section 3. Collective Logic. Affective logic is one of the supports of collective logic. We will not study the latter now, as we will address it in the chapter devoted to collective opinions and beliefs. We will only remind you that affective logic and collective logic cannot be confused, the latter only manifesting itself in crowds and being able to provoke acts contrary to those inspired by affective logic. We will see later how the collective soul momentarily created by a crowd represents a very special aggregate where the impossible does not exist, where foresight is ignored, where sensitivity always appears hypertrophied, and where rational logic is entirely devoid of action. We have just shown in this chapter that effective logic, along with the mystical logic which will now be examined, constitutes the true motive for our actions. To act, one must first feel. As soon as we have felt, this logic comes into play. Its influence dominates all ages. Only very late did humankind learn to somewhat withdraw from its power. The time has not yet come when rational logic will dominate emotional logic instead of being dominated by it. Chapter 4: Mystical Logic. Section 1: The characteristics of mystical logic. Rational logic is a conscious logic that teaches us to reason, deliberate, make demonstrations, and discoveries. The logic of feelings is an unconscious logic, the usual source of our conduct, and whose sequences most often escape the action of intelligence. Mystical logic, which we will now examine, corresponds to a higher stage of mental life. Animals do not know it, even though they possess many of our feelings. Inferior to rational logic, and at an even higher stage of development, mystical logic nevertheless played a dominant role in the history of peoples through the beliefs it engendered. It is the origin of interpretations undoubtedly foreign to reason, but which constituted powerful motives for action. If rational logic had replaced mystical logic in the past, the course of history would have been different. Like effective logic, mystical logic accepts contradictions, but is not unconscious like the former, and often involves deliberation. The criterion we have used to classify the various forms of logic, action, clearly demonstrates the distinction between mystical logic and effective logic. The latter, in fact, often inspires actions contrary to our most obvious interests, actions that the logic of feelings would never dictate. The political history of nations contains numerous examples of this, and their religious history even more. No doubt, in cases analogous to those I am alluding to, where such strong emotional states as modesty and maternal love vanish, it is possible to object that this vanishing may result from the simple substitution of one feeling for another. But what then is the cause of this substitution? It is certainly not to be sought in rational logic, for no reason would justify such acts. It is even less to be sought in emotional logic. We must therefore necessarily invoke a different psychological mechanism. This mechanism constitutes mystical knowledge. By examining its role in the history of civilization, we will see even more clearly the divergences that separate it from effective logic. In mystical logic, natural causes, the only ones accepted by rational logic, are replaced by the capricious wills of superior beings or forces intervening in all our actions, which must be feared and appeased. Mystical logic reigned exclusively in the primitive phase of humanity, and despite the progress of rational logic, its influence is still very much alive. The power of mystical logic is observed especially in minds that have been aptly described as mystical, a term which we have used to define their logic. The mystical mentality is revealed by the attribution to a being, a specific object, or an unknown power, of a magical power independent of any rational action. The consequences of this mentality will vary from person to person. For some, it will serve as a foundation for defined religious beliefs, their contours clearly defined in the form of deities. For others, higher powers will remain vague but equally powerful. The mystical spirit will then manifest itself through some kind of superstition. An atheist can be just as mystical as a devout believer. Often, they are even more so. A mystical spirit is demonstrated by attributing certain supernatural properties to an amulet, a number, a miraculous water, a pilgrimage, a relic, or other such property. It is also manifested by assuming that a particular political or social institution has the power to transform people. Mysticism constantly changes form, but its core remains the role attributed to mysterious powers. Time, which alters the object of mysticism, leaves it untouched. Indifferent to all criticism, Mysticism breeds boundless credulity in its followers. Many men who call themselves free thinkers because they reject religious dogma firmly believe in premonitions, omens, and the magical power of the hangman's noose, or the number 13. For them, the world is populated by things that bring good or bad luck. There are no gamblers whose conviction on this point is not firmly established. The mystic's faith being boundless, no rational absurdity can shock him. He is impervious to reason, observation, and experience. The failure of his predictions proves nothing to him, since the supernatural powers invoked are by definition capricious and subject to no laws. As humanity becomes more civilized, the mystical spirit, universal among all savages, gradually becomes circumscribed and localized to certain individuals. For these individuals, the mentality of the civilized is scarcely distinguishable from that of the primitive, since no scientific argument shakes their faith. This observation will help us understand the genesis of the occult beliefs adopted by some eminent scholars. The progress of reason will likely be powerless to shake mysticism, for it will always find refuge in the realm of the afterlife, inaccessible to science. Those curious about this afterlife are, of course, countless. Section 2. Mysticism as the basis of beliefs. It is in mysticism that religious beliefs germinate, and all those which, without bearing this name, take on the same forms, certain political beliefs in particular. The consequences of mystical logic are most evident among savages. Devoid of any notion of natural laws, they live in a world populated by spirits that must be constantly appeased. Behind every visible reality, they always assume an invisible power that determines it. In civilization, man, in civilized man, beliefs are less rudimentary, because the notion of necessary laws is instilled in him through his entire education. He cannot deny them, but he nevertheless admits that prayers can influence supernatural powers to halt their action. Mystical logic and rational logic thus sometimes coexist in the same mind without interfering with each other. The credulity of the true believer is generally limitless, and no miracle could surprise him, since the power of the God he invokes is infinite. In Ovidio Cathedral, one can see a casket which, according to the information leaflet distributed to visitors, was instantly transported from Jerusalem through the air. It contains, quote, milk from the mother of Jesus Christ, the hair with which St. Mary Magdalene wiped the feet of the Saviour, the staff with which Moses parted the Red Sea, the wallet of St. Peter, etc. This document, like thousands of others, shows how alive mystical fetishism still is. If we consider it independent of the quality of its object, we can place in the same category the amulet of a black man, the relic enclosed in the golden casket of a majestic cathedral, and a hangman's noose. We should regard them with indulgent sympathy. Firstly, because they are sources of hope for happiness, and secondly, because they correspond to certain indestructible needs of the spirit. By tracing the influence of mystical logic through all aspects of social existence, we would see it at work in the arts, literature, politics, and even in the art of healing. The Romantic literary period is a manifestation of this. Artists held few but mystical convictions. The methods of rational analysis generally remained unknown to them. But it is above all in politics that the influence of the mystical spirit appears. Radicals, anti-clericals, Freemasons, and all sectarians of extreme persuasions live steeped in mysticism. The working class is also dominated by an intense mysticism. Since the regions where science has been able to penetrate remain very limited, while our aspirations are boundless, mystical logic will undoubtedly dominate humanity for a long time to come. Creator of laws, customs, and religions, she brought forth all the illusions that have guided humanity thus far. Her power is great enough to transform the unreal into the real. Under her influence, millions of people have known joy, sorrow, or hope. Every ideal sprang from her womb. Mystical logic, sentimental logic, and rational logic represent three forms of mental activity that are irreducible to one another. Therefore, it is pointless to pit them against each other. Chapter 5. Intellectual Logic. Section 1. The fundamental elements of intellectual logic. Intellectual logic has been the subject of countless writings of rather mediocre usefulness. If we discuss it here, it is firstly because it sometimes plays a certain role in the genesis of opinions, and secondly, to further clarify how it differs from the other forms of logic studied in the previous chapters. Let us begin by indicating some of the elements on which the exercise of rational logic is based: will, attention, and reflection. Will. It is the faculty of deciding on an act and generally comprises three phases: deliberation, determination, execution. A determination is called volition. A resolution is also called a decision. Willpower is both affective and rational in origin. Affective in origin because all the motives for our actions have an affective substrate. Rational in origin because through attention and reflection we can combine mental representations in the mind that are capable of cancelling each other out. Contrary to what psychology teaches, we will say that willpower can be conscious or unconscious. Unconscious willpower is even the strongest. Animals do not possess other willpowers, and neither do most humans. The reason we find it difficult to observe unconscious forms of will is that, since reason intervenes after the fact to explain the actions performed, we imagine that it dictated them. Descartes, followed in this by several modern philosophers, considered the will to be a kind of entity opposed to intelligence and constituting the principle of our beliefs. According to him, to believe is to voluntarily give or withhold one's assent to an idea proposed by the intellect. This theory, still widely defended, will be challenged in this work, where I hope to show that belief is almost never voluntary. Aristotle came much closer than Descartes to the ideas presented here when he based his psychology on the distinction between sensory and intellectual faculties. For him, the will resulted from their combination. It was thus an effect, not a cause. As we can see, Aristotle contrasted sensitivity with intelligence, while Descartes placed will in opposition to it. Far from being mere subtleties, these distinctions are, on the contrary, important. The still predominant theory that belief is voluntary and rational rests on concepts analogous to those of Descartes. Attention. Attention is the act by which, under the action of a stimulus or of the will, the mind concentrates on an object to the exclusion of others, or on the mental representation of this object, or on the ideas which it gives rise to. Attention allows us to eliminate foreign states of consciousness and also to isolate the subject that interests us from the chaos of things. Several authors consider attention to be a form of will. It is certainly dependent on the will, but it should not be identified with it. Attention should not be confused with intelligence. It is only one of the elements used by the latter. The objects around us impresses all our senses. If we perceived them all in the same way a camera lens does, for example, our brains would be cluttered with useless images. Thanks to attention, we only perceive things in proportion to our needs and can focus all our intellectual capacity on a single subject without scattering it randomly. Animals are capable of attention, but this faculty is always involuntary in them, whereas in humans it can be voluntary. Our intellectual power largely stems from its development. Children and savages possess very little voluntary attention. The more a person is capable of attention, and consequently of reflection, the greater their intellectual strength. A Newton without a great capacity for attention is inconceivable. The brilliant intuition that appears suddenly has always been preceded by patient attention and lengthy reflection. Reflection. The birth of reflection engenders in humankind the faculty of reasoning. It consists of the ability to bring back to the mind and fix, by means of attention, the mental representations derived from sensations in our world that are their signs. We can then combine them, compare them, and thus form judgments. These judgments allow us to know not things in themselves, but their relationships, the only attainable goal of science. The ability to think always implies the ability to pay attention. A poor attention span leads to a poor capacity for thinking. Reflection allows for sound reasoning, provided that emotional and mystical considerations do not interfere. As soon as the subjects we wish to reason about fall within the realm of belief, reflection loses its critical power. Section 2. The role of rational logic. Rational logic proceeds by associating through reflection and following the previously indicated mechanism, mental representations, or the words that translate them. It was long considered the basis of our beliefs. We admit, on the contrary, that rational logic has not engendered any. Its only possible role is to finish off the erosion of them once they have been worn down by time. But while rational logic plays no role in the genesis of belief, it is, on the contrary, crucial in the constitution of knowledge. The entire edifice of the sciences and the colossal development of modern industry that resulted from it rests upon it. Its power cannot be exaggerated. But we must also recognize the limits it has not yet surpassed. The phenomena of life and thought remain closed to it. Its domain is that of raw matter, that is, matter momentarily destabilized by death or by time. It has shed only very uncertain light on phenomena representing a constant flow, such as life. Since science reigned supreme in the realm of knowledge, it was long believed that the intellectual logic from which it derives could explain the genesis and evolution of beliefs. This error persisted for centuries, and psychology is only now beginning to emerge from it. Observation should have shown, however, that beings act before they reason and understand, and consequently that they are guided in their actions by other forms of logic. Fully aware of this fact, which I often return to because it is still quite new, we recognize that rational logic plays a rather secondary role in the lives of individuals and peoples. It is not necessary to reason in order to act, and even less to understand. The humblest instincts acts as it should, without worrying about our logic. Understanding and reason are forms of human activity entirely independent of action. They often only hinder it by highlighting its dangers too much. Thanks to their emotional and mystical impulses, even the most ordinary people can act without suspecting the origins of their actions. It's pointless to try intellectual arguments on them. Their limited capacity for understanding leads them to regard with categorical contempt anything that surpasses their comprehension. Trying to instill rational ideas in them would be like a child trying to fit an orange into a thimble. One must understand the generally limited capacity of the minds of individuals and nations before attempting to introduce rational truths. The role of rational logic in governing peoples has always been very weak, and is hardly manifested except in speeches. It is not, I repeat, reason, but feelings that move them, and consequently guides them. To move, one must first move. We will soon show that in the struggle between rational logic and effective logic, the former is almost always defeated. Psychologists are increasingly recognizing this. To suppose, writes Ribot, quote, that a completely bare, dry idea, an abstract conception, without effective accompaniment, like a geometric notion, has the slightest influence on human conduct, is a psychological absurdity. Unquote. The time is far off when the world will be conquered by philosophical reasoning. On the contrary, it has always been, until now, shaken by beliefs scorned by rational logic, but which remains powerless to combat. Section 3. Late appearance of rational logic. It is not the work of nature, but was created against nature. I have already pointed out that rational logic appeared last. Other forms of logic suffice to guide all beings, from geological ages almost to the present day. Rational logic is not at all the work of nature, but of man against nature. Thanks to this creation of his intelligence, he is less and less subject to the forces that surround him, and succeeds more and more each day in subjugating them. This was a major conquest. To recognize that rational logic is not the product of nature, but a creation of man against nature, one must observe that his efforts consist mainly in fighting against natural actions. Completely indifferent to the fate of the individual, nature is concerned only with that of the species. Before it, all beings are equal. The existence of the most pernicious microbe surrounded by as much care as that of the greatest genius. Thanks to the acquisition of rational logic, we have been able to fight the fierce laws of the universe and sometimes even triumph over them. The true purpose of science is the constant struggle against natural iniquities. We are already subject to them only up to the precise limits of our knowledge. The day the mechanisms of biological and emotional logic are understood, we will know how to master them completely. Humankind will then possess the power attributed to its ancient gods. Science is obviously not there yet. It is still very far from it. although we are circumscribing the fatal power of nature a little more each day, we are still forced to submit to it and adapt to it. This immense power is perhaps even greater than science supposes. We are subject to nature, but might not nature itself. According to the saying attributed by Aeschylus to Prometheus chained to his rock, be subject to the necessities that govern destiny and to which the gods themselves must submit. Philosophy is not yet advanced enough to answer such questions.